Snow whipped across the cracked concrete like shattered glass. Each frozen particle carrying with it the kind of sting that no amount of layering could fully prevent. The temperature in Minneapolis had dropped to 14 degrees below zero, and the wind chill rolling off the Mississippi River pushed that number into a range that made exposed skin burn within 60 seconds. It was the dead of January, and the city had surrendered to the freeze. Streets that normally hummed with traffic and nightlife sat empty, abandoned to the brutal cold, their neon signs flickering against swirling walls of white like the last distress signals of a dying vessel. Cordell Brennan pushed his way through the heavy glass revolving doors of his office building on Hennepin Avenue and immediately felt the cold try to kill him. It hit his face first, a sharp and physical blow that made his eyes water and his nostrils seal shut with each inhale. He was 32 years old, a junior architect at a mid-sized commercial firm, and he had been staring at AutoCAD blueprints for 14 hours straight. His eyes burned, his lower back carried a dull, persistent ache that ran from his tailbone to the base of his skull. Every muscle in his body wanted nothing more than a hot shower, a heavy blanket, and the merciful unconsciousness of sleep. He pulled his thick navy blue Carhartt parka tighter around his torso and buried his chin into the faux fur collar. The coat was an investment, $200 of insulated armor against the unforgiving Midwestern winters. Right now, standing on the frozen sidewalk with the wind screaming through the downtown corridor, it was the only thing keeping his organs from shutting down. His Honda Civic had refused to start in the company parking garage. The battery had finally given up after 3 winters of abuse, leaving him stranded with a 6-block trek to the nearest transit hub. 6 blocks. Under normal conditions, a 10-minute walk. Tonight in this weather, it might as well have been a forced march across a frozen tundra. Cordell lowered his head and started walking. The streets were desolate. The usual bustle of the city had been suffocated by the freeze, leaving behind a ghostly landscape of empty sidewalks and shuttered storefronts. His boots crunched against the icy pavement in a rhythm that echoed off the surrounding buildings, the only sound in the eerie silence besides the howling wind. He moved quickly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of the Carhartt, his shoulders hunched forward against the assault. As he approached the intersection of Lake Street, something caught his eye. A small, huddled mass was pressed against the plexiglass windbreak of a bus shelter, motionless and low to the ground. At first, Cordell thought it was a pile of discarded blankets, a tragic but common sight in any major American city. But as he drew closer, a violent and rhythmic shivering gave away the presence of a human being beneath the fabric. Cordell slowed his pace. His breath puffed into thick white clouds that were immediately snatched away by the wind. Sitting on the steel bench inside the shelter was a young girl. She looked 16, maybe 17 years old. She was disastrously underdressed for the conditions. A faded and threadbare denim jacket was clutched tightly over a thin cotton hoodie. Her legs were covered only by ripped jeans, and her feet were shoved into canvas sneakers that were soaked through with dirty slush. She had her knees pulled up to her chest, her bare hands tucked beneath her armpits, in a desperate and failing attempt to preserve whatever core heat her body still possessed. Cordell stopped walking. He had lived in Minnesota his entire life. He knew what hypothermia looked like. He knew the stages. The first stage was violent shivering, the body's desperate attempt to generate heat through muscle contractions. The second stage was when the shivering began to slow, when the muscles became too exhausted to continue their futile fight. The third stage was the one that killed. The body stopped shivering entirely. A dangerous calm settled over the victim. They became lethargic, confused, and then they simply stopped breathing. This girl was transitioning up from the first stage into the second. He could see it in the way her shivering came in irregular waves, each one weaker than the last. He could see it in the way her eyelids fluttered heavy and drooping, a lethargy settling over her that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with her organs beginning to surrender. She was dying. Right here in a bus shelter on Lake Street, a 17-year-old girl was dying. Cordell called out to her. His voice came out muffled, swallowed by the howling wind, and he had to shout it again before the girl reacted. Her head snapped up. In the harsh, jaundiced glare of the street lamp overhead, he saw her face clearly. Her lips were a terrifying shade of pale blue. Her skin had taken on a waxy and translucent quality, the blood retreating from the surface in a last-ditch effort to protect the vital organs. Mascara ran down her cheeks in frozen black lines, evidence that she had been crying for a very long time. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot and feral, the look of a cornered animal waiting for a final blow. She told him to leave her alone, The words came out broken, shattered by the violent chattering of her jaw, her teeth clicking together so loudly that Cordell could hear it from 3 feet away. He told her she was going to freeze to death. He took a cautious step into the shelter, keeping his hands visible, not wanting to frighten her. He explained that the buses had stopped running an hour ago, that the transit grid was suspended because of the ice. Nobody was coming. No bus was going to pull up and save her. She told him to back off. She spat the words with as much venom as a freezing teenager could muster. But the defiance in her voice was entirely undermined by the collapse of her body. Her eyelids fluttered again. Her head dipped forward, then snapped back up. The apathy phase was taking hold. Her brain was starting to shut down non-essential functions to keep the heart beating for a few more minutes. Cordell did not think about the warnings of city living. He did not think about the scams or the dangers of approaching strangers in the dead of night. He did not weigh the risks or calculate the consequences. He saw a kid whose life was measured in minutes, and every second he spent deliberating was a second closer to the point of no return. He unzipped his Carhartt parka. The wind hit his thin wool sweater like a wall of frozen knives. The cold was immediate and absolute, bypassing the fabric and driving straight into his muscles, his bones, his blood. A jolt of agony shot through his torso, and for a brief and terrible moment, his vision narrowed to a pinpoint. His body screamed at him to put the coat back on to save himself to walk away. He did not walk away. He slipped the heavy parka off his shoulders, stepped forward, and draped it over the girl. The coat was massive on her thin frame, swallowing her entirely in insulated warmth. He pulled the heavy hood over her matted blonde hair and zipped it up to her chin. He could feel her trembling beneath the fabric, a faint and desperate vibration, like a small engine struggling to turn over in the cold. She looked up at him with an expression that pierced through the haze of hypothermia. Confusion. Disbelief. The beginning of something that might have been gratitude if her brain had possessed the capacity to process it. She tried to speak. Her voice cracked on the first syllable. Cordell cut her off. He told her there was a 24-hour diner 2 blocks south. He told her to keep moving, to get inside, to order a black coffee to get warm. He told her not to sit here. His own teeth were already beginning to chatter, the brutal cold claiming his unprotected body with terrifying speed. Before she could respond, before she could say thank you or ask his name or do anything at all, Cordell turned and ran. He ran because he had to. Without the parka, his body temperature was dropping at a rate that gave him maybe 8 minutes before his own muscles began to seize. He sprinted down the frozen sidewalk, his leather shoes slipping on patches of black ice, the wind tearing through his sweater and turning the sweat on his back into a thin layer of frost. He ran 4 blocks without stopping, his lungs burning, his fingers and toes going numb, the world narrowing to a single objective: get to the heated train car, get inside, survive. He did not look back. He left the girl sitting in the bus shelter, wrapped in his coat, vanishing into the swirling white darkness behind him. The next 48 hours were a brutal exercise in survival of a different kind. Cordell had barely made it onto the heated train car that night. By the time he stumbled through the front door of his ground floor duplex in the Whittier neighborhood, he could not feel his fingers or his toes or the tip of his nose. He spent the entire weekend cocooned in heavy duvets, shivering violently as his body fought off the deep-seated chill that had settled into his core. Fever came first, then chest congestion, then a cough that sounded like something structural was collapsing inside his ribcage. By Monday morning, the fever had broken. What remained was a lingering cough and a fatigue so profound that even the simple act of making coffee felt like an athletic endeavor. It was while standing in his kitchen, dressing in layers to compensate for the missing winter coat, that the realization hit him. It came suddenly and without warning, a cold and paralyzing bolt of awareness that froze him mid-motion, his hand hovering over the kitchen counter where he kept his keys. His wallet was in his back pocket. His phone had been in his hand, but his dark brown leather card holder, the one he kept in the interior zippered breast pocket of the Carhartt, the one containing his company access badge, his corporate EasyQuadra credit card, and his Minnesota driver's license with his full legal name and his home address printed in neat block letters, was gone. It was in the coat he had wrapped around a stranger and walked away from. Panic flooded his chest, cold and sharp and immediate. He tried to rationalize it on the bus ride into downtown. She was just a runaway. She probably pawned the coat for cash or was still wearing it somewhere. If she found the card holder, she would throw it away. Nobody was going to show up at his house. Nobody cared about a random driver's license found in the pocket of a donated winter coat. It was fine. Everything was fine. The nagging anxiety refused to dissipate. He spent the morning at his desk, distracted and jumpy, his concentration fractured beyond repair. Every time his phone vibrated, he flinched. Every time a door opened in the corridor, his head snapped toward the sound. He canceled his corporate credit card, requested a new building badge, and told Human Resources he had lost his wallet over the weekend. Routine precautions. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry. At 2 p.m, his supervisor, Richard, walked into the drafting room. Richard was a tightly wound senior partner who wore his stress like a second skin. Today, that stress was dialed up to a frequency Cordell had never seen before. Richard's usually immaculate tie was loosened at the collar. A thin sheen of sweat glistened across his forehead, despite the aggressive air conditioning. Richard leaned against the cubicle partition and told Cordell that something very uncomfortable had just happened at the front reception desk. A man had walked into the lobby, a massive man. Richard described him carefully, choosing his words with the measured precision of someone recounting a car accident. Leather vest, tattoos covering his neck and hands, patches sewn onto the vest that Richard did not recognize, but that made the security guard reach for his radio. The man had bypassed the security checkpoint without slowing down, walked straight up to Brenda at the front desk, and slammed a business card down on the marble counter. The business card belonged to Cordell Brennan. The man had asked in a voice that Richard described as sounding like a diesel engine idling in a gravel pit, whether a Cordell Brennan worked in this building. Brenda, panicking behind her professional smile, had told the man that Cordell was out sick. The man had not said another word. He had picked up the card, turned to face the security camera mounted above the reception desk, and stared directly into the lens for a full 10 seconds. Then he had walked out, climbed onto a motorcycle parked illegally on the sidewalk, and disappeared into traffic before building security could respond. Richard asked Cordell if he was in trouble, if he owed money to the wrong people, if there was something the firm should know about. Cordell said no. He said it was a stolen card, a misunderstanding. His voice was tight and controlled, but his hands were trembling beneath the desk where Richard could not see them. The moment Richard left the drafting room, Cordell packed his briefcase. He could not stay in this building. If they had the business card, they had found the leather card holder. And if they had the card holder, they had his driver's license. They knew where he worked. They knew where he lived. Cordell left through the freighted elevator at the back of the building. He walked quickly through the loading dock, his eyes scanning every parked vehicle, every shadow, every figure on the sidewalk. His mind raced through scenarios that grew more terrifying with each passing block. The Hells Angels, the motorcycle clubs that operated in the outer suburbs of the Twin Cities. He had seen the documentaries. He had read the news stories. Extortion, trafficking, violence as a business model. Why would they be looking for him? What had the girl done? Was she connected to them? Did they think he had taken something from her? Did they think he had hurt her? He practically ran the 3 blocks to the bus stop. The entire ride home, he sat in the back row, watching every vehicle that pulled alongside the bus, convinced that every dark SUV or rumbling motorcycle was following him. When he reached his duplex, he locked the deadbolt, fastened the chain, and drew every blind in the house. He paced the hardwood floors of his living room in the gathering darkness, the silence of the empty house pressing in on him from every direction. He pulled a heavy steel flashlight from the kitchen drawer and held it in his right hand. A pathetic weapon against an organized criminal enterprise. But the weight of it in his palm provided a microscopic and entirely irrational sense of security. He sat on the edge of his sofa in the dark, staring at the locked front door and waited. Hours passed. The radiator hissed and clanged in its ancient rhythm. Shadows shifted across the ceiling as headlights swept past the window. Each time a car slowed on the street outside, Cordell's heart seized in his chest and he held his breath until the vehicle accelerated away. By 10 o'clock, exhaustion was winning the war against terror. His eyelids drooped. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the afternoon was burning out, leaving behind a hollow and trembling fatigue. He began to convince himself that the incident at the office was an isolated event, a bizarre misunderstanding. Tomorrow he would file a police report about the stolen cards, and this entire nightmare would fade into an unsettling anecdote he would tell at dinner parties. Then the rumble began. It started low, almost subsonic, a vibration in the floorboards that Cordell felt in his teeth and his ribcage before he heard it with his ears. a rhythmic, heavy thumping that seemed to resonate in the foundation of the house itself. Then came the sound. Not a single engine. A chorus. The unmistakable deep-throated roar of American V-twin engines, multiple machines running in formation, their combined output shaking the walls and rattling the picture frames on their hooks. Cordell shot up from the sofa. His heart hammered against his ribs with such force that he could hear the blood pounding in his ears. The flashlight in his hand was slick with sweat. The engines grew louder. Headlights pierced the narrow gaps in the window blinds, casting wild and strobing slices of white light across the living room walls. The noise reached a crescendo directly outside his front window, a wall of sound so powerful it vibrated the glass in its frame, and then one by one the engines cut out. Silence, heavy and absolute, more terrifying than the noise itself. Then came the footsteps, heavy boots on frozen snow. Multiple sets of them crunching up the driveway with a deliberate and unhurried cadence that suggested absolute confidence. These were not men who expected resistance. These were men who were accustomed to getting what they came for. Cordell backed away from the front door. He retreated into the shadow of the hallway, his back pressed against the wall. Bile rose in his throat. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the dial pad, ready to punch in 911. But a paralyzing thought stopped him cold. What if they kicked the door in before the police arrived? What if calling the cops made it worse? What if these were the kind of men for whom police involvement was not a deterrent, but an escalation? The knocking came, heavy and rhythmic. Not the polite rapping of a neighbor or a delivery driver. This was the sound of a massive fist striking wood with enough force to make the door frame groan. 3 deliberate impacts, each one sending a tremor through the walls. A voice spoke from the other side, deep and commanding with the quality of grinding gravel poured over rough iron. The voice said his name. The voice told him to open the door. Cordell could not speak. His vocal cords were locked. The knocking came again. 3 more impacts. The voice repeated the command, adding that it knew he was inside, that the lights had been checked, and that if the door was not opened voluntarily, it would be removed from its hinges. The voice added almost as an afterthought that it did not want to break his house. Cordell closed his eyes. He drew in a ragged breath that tasted like bile and carpet dust. If they wanted to kill him, they would not be knocking. If they wanted to drag him into a van, they would have kicked the door in 30 seconds ago. Running was impossible. The back door led to a fenced yard with no exit. He was trapped, and the only variable he could control was whether the door was open with his cooperation or without it. He walked forward on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. He unhooked the chain. He turned the deadbolt. He opened the door 3 inches and peered out into the freezing night. Standing on a small concrete porch was a mountain of a man. He stood at least 6 feet 5 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the streetlights behind him. He wore a heavy black leather vest over a thick flannel shirt, and on the chest of that vest was the unmistakable Winged Death's head insignia, the colors red and white, the word Minnesota stitched in a bottom rocker. A smaller patch on the breast read SGT, at arms. The man's face was weathered and scarred, framed by a thick graying beard that fell to his chest. His knuckles were heavily tattooed, and they rested casually on the massive silver buckle of his belt. Behind him, parked in a precise and intimidating line along the curb, were 4 custom Harley-Davidson motorcycles. 3 other men stood beside the bikes, watching the house with the patient stillness of predators. The giant asked if he was Cordell Brennan. Cordell said yes. The word came out as a croak stripped of all composure. The man reached behind his back. Cordell flinched. Every muscle in his body contracted in anticipation of a weapon, a blade, a gun, something designed to end his life on this frozen porch. He squeezed his eyes shut. Instead, he heard the heavy rustle of fabric. The giant told him to look. Cordell opened his eyes. The man was holding up the navy blue Carhartt parka. It looked comically small in his massive calloused hands, like a child's toy. The man introduced himself. His name was Magnus Dalton. People called him Forge. 3 nights ago, his daughter Delaney had a fight with her mother. She was 17 and scared and stubborn, and she had decided to run. She wanted a bus to Chicago to an aunt who might take her in. She got off at the wrong transit station downtown, had her purse stolen by an opportunist, and found herself stranded in 14 below weather with no phone, no money, and no way to get home. Forge stepped closer. The sheer physical mass of the man forced Cordell to take a step backward, and the door swung open wider. Forge did not cross the threshold. He stood on the porch holding the coat and spoke with a voice that trembled at its edges despite the enormous effort he was clearly making to hold it steady. The doctors at Hennepin County Medical Center had told him that Delaney's core temperature had dropped to a level where her organs were beginning to shut down. Her kidneys were failing. Her heart rhythm was becoming erratic. They told him that if she had been exposed to the elements for another 30 minutes, she would have fallen asleep on that bench and never woken up. They told him that the only reason she made it to the diner, the only reason she was alive, was because someone had given her a coat and told her to move. Forge's voice cracked. It was a brief and almost imperceptible fracture in the armor, a half-second lapse in the terrifying composure of a man who looked like he could tear a car door off its hinges. But Cordell heard it, and in that fraction of a second, the mountain of muscle and leather and tattoos dissolved, and what stood on the porch was a father. A desperate and grateful and utterly broken father who had come within 30 minutes of burying his daughter. Forge reached into the breast pocket of the parka and pulled out the dark brown leather card holder. He held it out. He said it had taken a few days to track Cordell down. He said Cordell had made it harder by sneaking out through the back of his office building that afternoon. Cordell took the card holder. His hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it. He told Forge that he just could not let her sit there. The words came out in a whisper, quiet and simple and entirely insufficient to describe the decision that had driven him to strip his coat off in the middle of a killing freeze. Forge stared at him. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, loaded with something that Cordell could not identify. Then the massive biker stepped forward, grabbed Cordell by the back of the neck, and pulled him into a fierce and bone-crushing embrace. Cordell felt the air leave his lungs. He felt the rough leather of the vest against his cheek, the heat of the giant's body, the tremor running through those enormous arms. Forge spoke directly into his ear. The words were low and thick with emotion. He said that Cordell had saved his world, his entire world. When Forge released him, he shoved the heavy parka into Cordell's chest. He told him to put it on. He was coming with them. The other bikers wanted to buy a drink for the man who had saved his daughter. And when his club wanted to buy someone a drink, the invitation was not optional. The ride through the frozen streets of Minneapolis was a sensory overload of freezing wind, roaring exhaust, and blinding adrenaline. Cordell found himself clinging to the passenger seat of a massive customized Harley-Davidson Road Glide, driven by a wiry biker introduced only as Suttree. The man had a silver chain wallet that whipped violently against the fender with every bump in the road. Cordell had his arms wrapped around the Suttree's torso, the Carhartt doing its best to block the vicious wind chill, and he held on with the desperate grip of a man who had never ridden a motorcycle in his life and was fairly certain this would be how he died. They crossed the river into northeast Minneapolis, where gentrified microbreweries sat in uneasy proximity to decaying century-old industrial warehouses. Forge led the formation, his ape-hanger handlebars towering in the night air as he banked aggressively onto a poorly lit side street. They pulled into a gravel lot surrounding a massive windowless cinder block building. The only sign of life was a heavy steel door under a single flickering halogen bulb and a cluster of roughly 30 motorcycles parked with military precision along the southern wall. Cordell dismounted on legs that felt like they had been replaced with wet rope. Forge adjusted his leather cut and told Cordell to stay close. These boys did not take kindly to outsiders wandering around uninvited. But tonight, Cordell was under his protection. Forge wrapped a specific syncopated rhythm on the steel door. A reinforced viewport snapped open. A pair of dark eyes evaluated them, and then the viewport snapped shut. Heavy deadbolts clacked in sequence. The door swung outward, unleashing a wall of heat-stale cigarette smoke and the grinding guitar riffs of heavy metal music. Cordell stepped inside and entered another world. The warehouse interior had been converted into a sprawling bar and gathering hall. A long, scarred mahogany counter ran down the left wall lined with towering men in leather and denim. A pool table dominated the center of the room, illuminated by a low-hanging stained glass lamp. The walls were adorned with framed newspaper clippings, faded photographs of motorcycles and club memorabilia that seemed to document decades of history. At the far end, a raised platform held a large circular oak table that functioned as a kind of throne room. Every head in the room turned as Forge walked in. The music did not stop, but every conversation did. A heavy silence fell across the space and dozens of eyes locked onto Cordell with the kind of focused hostility that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He was glaringly out of place. a civilian in a blue winter coat, surrounded by men who wore their violence as casually as their tattoos. Someone at the pool table made a comment, called Cordell a tourist. The man leaned on his cue stick, chalking the tip with slow and deliberate menace, a thick scar running through his left eyebrow. Forge did not slow down. He walked straight into the center of the room, his physical presence commanding absolute silence. He announced Cordell's name to the room. He told them what had happened. 3 nights ago, his daughter, 14 below zero, going into cardiac shock. And this man, this stranger, took the coat off his own back and walked away in the freeze. The doctor said he saved her life. The atmosphere in the room shifted like a weather front. The hostile glares dissolved, replaced by something quieter and more complex. Respect. Recognition. The man at the pool table slowly set his cue down. From the raised platform at the back of the room, a man stood up. He was not as large as Forge, but he possessed a wiry and dangerous energy that seemed to vibrate in the air around him. Slicked back dark hair, sharp features, a president's patch on his chest. His name was Rowan Kessler, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet enough to require absolute silence, but sharp enough to cut through steel. Rowan invited Cordell up to the platform. Forge clamped a heavy hand on Cordell's shoulder and guided him through the parting crowd. Rowan extended a hand covered in faded silver rings and shook Cordell's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. He said Cordell had a lot of nerve walking away from his coat in the middle of a Minnesota winter. Cordell told him the truth. He said he did not think about it. He just knew the girl was not going to make it. Rowan studied him for a long moment with eyes that seemed to evaluate everything and give away nothing. Then he raised a glass of whiskey and addressed the entire room. The room erupted in a unified roar. Cordell drank. The whiskey burned down his throat and pooled warmly in his stomach, and for a single surreal moment, the terror that had been squeezing his chest since Monday morning released its grip entirely. He was standing in the inner sanctum of an outlaw motorcycle club, and they were treating him like a hero. The moment did not last. Forge leaned in close, his expression hardening into something that erased the grateful father and replaced him with the sergeant at arms. He told Cordell to finish his drink, because there was something Cordell needed to know, and it was going to change everything. Forge guided Cordell to a heavy leather booth in the corner of the raised platform, shrouded in shadows and away from the main floor. Rowan stood at the edge of the booth, acting as a physical barrier between their conversation and the rest of the club. Forge spoke first. He told Cordell that the man who had visited his office that afternoon was not one of their people. The man was not a member of their club. He was not a brother. He was not a friend. Cordell felt the whiskey turn to acid in his stomach. The man at the front desk, the massive tattooed figure who had slammed the business card down on the marble and stared into the security camera with the calm of a predator marking its territory, was a scout. He worked for a rival organization called the Sons of Silence, a competing motorcycle syndicate that had been pushing into the Twin Cities for the past 18 months. And the Sons of Silence were not looking for Cordell because they wanted to thank him. Forge laid out the situation with the blunt efficiency of a man who had spent decades navigating a world where information was currency and time was a luxury nobody could afford. 2 weeks before the night Cordell gave away his coat, his daughter Delaney had been cutting through the alley behind the old Grain Belt Brewery on the northeast side. It was a shortcut she took regularly, a narrow and poorly lit passage between 2 abandoned industrial buildings. On this particular night, she was in the wrong place at the worst possible time. She walked into the middle of a meeting. 3 men from the Sons of Silence and a supplier from out of state standing in the alley behind a row of dumpsters conducting business that was never meant to have witnesses. The meeting went wrong. An argument escalated. One of the Sons of Silence members, a man who would later be identified as the head of the entire Twin Cities operation, drew a weapon and shot the supplier in the chest at close range. The man dropped to the frozen pavement and did not get back up. Delaney saw the entire thing from behind a dumpster 12 feet away. She ran. She ran through the alley and across 2 parking lots and down a residential street, her heart slamming against her ribs, her mind struggling to process the violence she had just witnessed. But in her panic, she dropped her phone. It slipped out of her jacket pocket and landed on the pavement in the alley, and she did not stop to pick it up. The Sons of Silence found the phone within minutes. They unlocked it. They identified her. They realized that the sole witness to their murder was the daughter of the sergeant at arms of the rival club, and that if she told her father what she saw, the consequences would be catastrophic. They started looking for her. The club had moved quickly, stashing Delaney at a safe house in St. Paul, but the hunt was relentless. Delaney spent a week in hiding, terrified and isolated, before she panicked and bolted. She thought she was protecting her mother by disappearing. She wanted to get on a Greyhound bus and vanish to Chicago to an aunt who lived off the grid. She got off at the wrong station, had her purse stolen, and ended up freezing to death at a bus stop on Lake Street. That was where Cordell found her, and when Cordell wrapped her in his coat, his identification went with her. She was taken to the hospital in the coat. And while she lay unconscious in the intensive care unit for 2 days, a nurse at Hennepin County Medical, a woman who had been on the Sons of Silence payroll for 3 years, reporting whenever club members showed up in the emergency room with injuries that could not be explained by civilian accidents, went through the pockets. She found the card holder. She photographed the driver's license and the company badge and sent both images to her handler. The Sons of Silence now believed that Cordell Brennan was a club associate. They believed he had been operating as a mule tasked with extracting Delaney from the city and delivering her to safety before she could testify about what she saw. The man at the office was a scout sent to verify his identity and his workplace. The next step, if Forge and his brothers had not arrived first, would have been a team sent to Cordell's home to extract information by any means necessary. Cordell felt the blood drain from his face. The air in the booth seemed to thicken each breath, requiring conscious effort. He managed to say the words out loud. The man at his office was a Son of Silence. Forge nodded. He said they had barely beaten the rival club to Cordell's house. 10 minutes later, and the men standing on that porch would not have been wearing his colors. Cordell opened his mouth to respond, to plead, to demand an explanation for how a simple act of human decency had spiraled into a death sentence. But before a single word left his lips, a commotion erupted near the back of the clubhouse. The heavy steel rear door banged open, and 2 of the bikers stationed in the back hallway rushed forward, hands on their weapons. But the person who stepped through the doorway was not a threat. She was a teenage girl in an oversized hoodie and worn-out boots, her blonde hair pulled back in a tangled knot, her face flushed from cold and exertion. Delaney Dalton had walked into the clubhouse unannounced and alone. The reaction was immediate. Forge was on his feet in a fraction of a second, his massive frame crossing the room in 3 strides. He caught his daughter by the shoulders, his face cycling through shock, fury, and relief in rapid succession. He demanded to know how she had gotten here. He demanded to know who had brought her here. He demanded to know why she was not at the safe house in St. Paul where she was supposed to be. Delaney did not flinch. She stood in front of her father, 120 pounds, facing down 6.5 feet of barely contained rage, and she spoke with a calm that did not match her age or her circumstances. She told him she had left the safe house because she had to. One of the men assigned to guard her had been making phone calls he should not have been making. Leaving the room at odd hours, speaking in whispers he thought she could not hear. She did not know who he was reporting to, but she knew enough to know that the safe house was compromised. Rowan stepped forward, his expression sharpening. He asked her how she got from St. Paul to the clubhouse on her own. Delaney told him she had walked 2 miles to a gas station, used a stranger's phone to call a cab, and directed the driver to a bar 3 blocks from the clubhouse. She walked the rest of the way. She knew the route because she had been coming to this building since she was a child. The room was silent. Every biker within earshot was watching the 17-year-old girl who had just conducted her own extraction from a compromised safe house without alerting anyone on either side. Then Delaney saw Cordell. She stopped speaking. Her eyes locked onto him across the room, and Cordell watched the recognition register in her face. Her lips parted. Her eyes widened. The hard composure she had been maintaining in front of her father and the club president cracked just for a moment, and what surfaced underneath was raw and unguarded. She walked toward him. She stopped 3 feet away. She said 2 words. It was him, the man from the bus shelter, the man who gave her his coat and ran away into the snow. Cordell nodded. He could not think of anything to say that would be adequate for the situation. Delaney looked at him for a long moment, and then she turned to Forge and Rowan. The composure returned harder and more deliberate than before. There was something she had been keeping from everyone, she said. Something she had not told her to father the club or anyone at the safe house. Something she had held back because hearing it would change everything, and she had not been sure who she could trust with the information. The night she witnessed the killing in the alley, the moments immediately after the gunshot, while she was still frozen behind the dumpster, too terrified to run, she heard the shooter make a phone call. He dialed a number and spoke to someone on the other end. He used a name. He used a rank. Detective Colton Merrick, 3rd Precinct. The shooter had told Merrick to come clean up the scene. He had spoken to the detective not as a contact or an informant, but as an employee. As someone who was expected to follow orders and who had been following them for a long time. The silence in the booth was absolute. Forge's massive hands were gripping the edge of the table so tightly that the wood creaked under the pressure. Rowan stood perfectly still, his sharp features betraying nothing but his eyes had gone dark and cold. Delaney told them that this was why she had not gone to the police. This was why she had not told her father. Because the moment she heard a police detective's name come out of the mouth of the man who had just committed murder, she understood that the system that was supposed to protect her was part of the system that wanted her dead. She had kept the information locked inside her for 2 weeks, and she was only revealing it now because the situation had escalated beyond the point where silence was a viable strategy. An innocent man, she said, looking directly at Cordell, was about to lose his life because of a coat he had given to a stranger, and that was something she could not carry on her conscience. Rowan began to speak, his voice tight with the controlled fury of a man who had just learned that the enemy's network was deeper and more entrenched than he had ever suspected. He said they needed to move quickly. They needed to verify the information about Merrick. They needed to reassess every security protocol that involved interaction with the 3rd Precinct. They needed to understand the full scope of the corruption before they could plan their next move. He never finished this sentence. The sound that interrupted him was not subtle. It was not a warning shot or a dramatic entrance. It was the detonation of the heavy steel front door being blown off its hinges by a concentrated blast of force that sent the reinforced deadbolts flying across the room like shrapnel. The concussive wave shattered the stained glass lamp above the pool table and knocked 2 of the nearest bikers off their feet. Through the cloud of concrete dust and smoke that filled the entryway, the silhouette of a rifle barrel cut through the harsh light from outside. Gunfire erupted before anyone could shout a warning. The sharp, rapid crack of semi-automatic weapons filled the warehouse, the muzzle flashes strobing through the dust cloud like camera flashes in a nightmare. Bullets chewed through the mahogany bars, sending splinters and shattered glass cascading across the floor. The pool table took a burst that ripped the felt surface apart and sent the heavy balls scattering across the concrete like marbles. The club reacted with the speed of men who had been in this situation before. Heavy caliber handguns appeared from holsters and waistbands in hidden compartments behind the bar. Return fire began within seconds, the deeper boom of large caliber pistols answering the higher crack of the assault weapons. Muzzle fire lit the warehouse in stuttering flashes of yellow and orange. Forge grabbed Delaney with one arm and Cordell with the other. He hauled both of them over the heavy oak table on the elevated platform, slamming them to the floor behind its thick wooden shield. The table absorbed 3 rounds that would have torn through flesh and bone. Suttree, the wiry biker who had driven Cordell to the clubhouse, was caught in the open near the bar. A round tore through his right thigh, and he went down hard, bright arterial blood soaking through his heavy denim jeans and pooling on the scuffed floorboards. He screamed a sound that cut through the rhythmic percussion of the gunfight. Rowan was behind the bar, firing a matte black shotgun toward the breached entrance with methodical precision. He called for suppressing fire, and 5 of his men rose simultaneously from behind overturned tables and steel kegs, unleashing a concentrated barrage that drove the attackers back toward the doorway. Cordell was on the floor, his face pressed against cold concrete that smelled of stale beer and gun oil. His hands were clamped over his ears, but it did nothing to dampen the apocalyptic volume of the firefight. Every cell in his body was screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was pinned behind a table in the middle of a war zone, and the only thing between him and a bullet was 5 inches of oak and the body of a giant biker who had positioned himself as a human shield over both Cordell and his daughter. Delaney was beside him. She was flat on the floor, her arms wrapped around her head, her body trembling. But she was not screaming. She was not panicking. Through the chaos, Cordell saw her eyes. They were open and focused, scanning the room, cataloging the exits and the threats with a clarity that seemed impossible for a teenager in the middle of a gunfight. The firing from the entrance began to falter. The invaders, 4 men wearing the distinct patches of the Sons of Silence, were being pushed back by the overwhelming return fire. One of them took a round to the shoulder and spun violently before collapsing into the frozen gravel outside. Another grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward a waiting vehicle. Rowan called out the order. "Do not pursue. They want us in the open. Secure the building." The gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was the silence of damaged eardrums and settling dust and the ragged breathing of men who were trying to determine whether they were still alive. Forge rolled off Cordell, and Delaney, his handgun still raised, his dark eyes scanning the destroyed room. He asked if they were breathing. Cordell managed a nod. Delaney pushed herself up to her hands and knees without assistance. Rowan emerged from behind the ruined bar, assessing the damage with cold efficiency. The clubhouse was destroyed. Walls pockmarked with bullet craters. The stained glass lamps reduced to glittering debris on the floor. The air thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and vaporized concrete. Suttree was being tended to by two brothers, a leather belt fashioned into a tourniquet above his bleeding thigh. Sirens were beginning to wail in the distance. The Minneapolis Police Department would be swarming the area within minutes. Rowan spoke quickly and with absolute authority. He said they could not be here when the police arrived. This was not a drive-by. This was an escalation. The Sons of Silence knew they had the girl, and now they knew they had Cordell. The clubhouse was burned. Every safe house in the metro area had to be considered compromised. He looked at Delaney, then he looked at Cordell. He said two words that sealed their fate. Protocol iron. Forge was already moving. He grabbed Cordell by the collar of the Carhartt and pulled him to his feet. Delaney was up on her own, moving toward the back hallway, with the instinct of someone who knew this building and knew that when the order came to disappear, the exit was not through the front door. They navigated through a labyrinth of dark hallways lined with motorcycle parts and stacked crates, finally reaching a reinforced steel door that opened onto a narrow, unlit alleyway. A matte black Ford Transit van idled in the shadows, its side door already open. Two armed club members sat inside, their faces invisible in the darkness. Forge pushed Delaney in first, then Cordell, then climbed in after them. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing them in absolute blackness. Through the thin metal walls of the van, Cordell could hear the approaching sirens, growing louder, their red and blue lights painting the alley walls in frantic pulses. The engine roared. The tires spun on ice. The van lurched forward and accelerated into the frozen night. Cordell Brennan sat in the darkness, his back against the cold metal wall of the van, his knees drawn to his chest. Beside him, Delaney sat in the same position, her shoulder touching his. He could feel her trembling, whether from cold or from fear or from the aftershock of nearly dying for the second time in a week, he could not tell. Forge sat across from them, a shadow among shadows, his injured hand wrapped in a strip of torn fabric, his breathing heavy but controlled. At some point during the drive, without ceremony or explanation, he reached across the narrow space and confiscated Cordell's phone. Cordell heard the window slide open briefly. He heard the phone hit the water of the Mississippi River far below as they crossed the Interstate 694 bridge. His last connection to his old life gone. He had no phone, no wallet, no keys, no way to contact his employer, his family, or anyone who had ever known the man he was before this night. He was a ghost riding in a metal box with men who operated outside the law, heading to a destination he did not know for a duration he could not predict, with no guarantee that he would survive to see tomorrow. 4 days ago, he had been a junior architect arguing about zoning permits and load-bearing walls. Now he was a fugitive, and sitting beside him, shoulder to shoulder in the freezing darkness, was the reason why. A 17-year-old girl who had stumbled into a murder and was now carrying secrets that could burn an entire city to the ground. Cordell pulled the Carhartt tighter around his chest. The coat that had started all of this, the coat he had given away on a frozen night because he could not walk past a dying girl. The coat that had come back to him, carrying with it the weight of a world he was never meant to enter. The van drove on through the darkness heading north, leaving Minneapolis and everything Cordell Brennan had ever known behind them. The journey north lasted nearly 3 hours. The heater in the back of the Ford Transit van produced a thin and anemic warmth that barely registered against the sub-zero temperature bleeding through the metal walls. But Cordell did not notice the cold. He sat on the narrow bench seat with his knees drawn up and his arms wrapped around his shins, his body folded into itself like a man bracing for an impact that had already happened. The darkness inside the van was total. No windows, no interior lights, just the muffled roar of the engine, the rhythmic thumping of the tires over uneven road, and the breathing of 3 other human beings sealed inside a metal box hurtling through the frozen Minnesota night. Forge sat directly across from him, a massive shadow occupying the opposite bench. The sergeant-at-arms had not spoken since they crossed the Interstate 694 bridge, where Cordell's phone had met its end in the black water of the Mississippi. Forge's silence was not hostile. It was the silence of a man conserving energy, cataloging threats, running calculations in a mind that had spent decades operating in environments where a single miscalculation meant a body in a ditch. Delaney sat beside Cordell, close enough that her shoulder pressed against his arm with every bump and sway of the van. She had not spoken either, but Cordell could feel the tension radiating off her in waves. She was not sleeping. She was not resting. She was coiled, every muscle in her thin frame drawn tight, her breathing shallow and controlled. He could hear her fingers drumming a soft and a rhythmic pattern against the fabric of her jeans, the unconscious tell of a mind working through problems at a speed that her body could not keep pace with. At some point during the drive, a second vehicle pulled alongside the van on the highway. Cordell heard the brief blare of a horn, 3 short pulses, and Forge shifted in the darkness, pressing his face close to a small ventilation slit near the ceiling. He grunted something that sounded like confirmation, then settled back into his seat. Escort vehicles. The club was not traveling alone. The highway eventually gave way to rougher terrain. The smooth hum of asphalt was replaced by the jarring crunch of gravel, and the van began to pitch and buck as the road surface deteriorated. They descended down a steep incline, the engine whining in a lower gear, and then the vehicle came to a complete stop. The engine idled for several seconds before cutting out entirely. The rear doors swung open, and the cold rushed in like a living thing. It was a different cold than the city. Sharper, cleaner, carrying with it the scent of pine resin and frozen lake water, and something ancient and untouched that had nothing to do with civilization. Cordell stepped out onto several inches of fresh snow. His boots sank into the powder, and he steadied himself against the side of the van as his eyes adjusted to the sudden brightness. A full moon hung low over the tree line, casting the landscape in a pale blue-white light that made the snow glow as if it were generating its own luminescence. They were in the middle of nowhere. Towering pine trees formed a dense and impenetrable wall on 3 sides, their branches sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. Directly ahead, set back from a small clearing, sat a large rustic log cabin. It was bigger than Cordell had expected, more lodge than cabin, with heavy timber construction and a steep pitched roof designed to shed the massive snow loads of northern Minnesota. But the details that drew his eye were not architectural. Heavy steel shutters covered every window. A satellite dish was mounted on the roof beside what looked like a communications antenna. The faint red glow of security cameras blinked beneath the eaves at measured intervals. Beyond the tree line, visible through a narrow gap in the pines, the frozen expanse of a massive lake stretched out into the moonlit darkness. Cordell recognized the geography. Lake Mille Lacs. They were roughly 150 miles north of Minneapolis, deep in the lake country that occupied the center of the state. Rowan Kessler emerged from the passenger side of a second vehicle, a blacked-out SUV that had been running escort behind the van. The club president looked exhausted. The adrenaline from the firefight had burned off during the drive, leaving behind the hollowed-out features and heavy-lidded eyes of a man operating on reserves that were dangerously close to empty. But his posture was straight, and his movements were deliberate. He surveyed the cabin and the perimeter with the practiced eye of a man who had used this location before and trusted it with his life. Nobody outside the senior officers knew this place existed, Rowan said. It was off the grid, purchased through 3 separate shell companies registered to names that did not belong to anyone in the organization. The nearest neighbor was 11 miles to the east. The nearest paved road was 4 miles to the south. If anyone came up the access road, the cameras would pick them up 6 minutes before they reached the clearing. Forge led them up the wooden steps and unlocked the heavy oak front door. The interior was warm, heated by a massive stone fireplace that crackled and popped in the center of the main room. The heat hit Cordell like a wall, and his body responded with an involuntary shudder as the deep-seated cold that had been living in his bones since the ride began to release its grip. Leather couches flanked the fireplace. A long dining table occupied the center of the open floor plan, surrounded by heavy wooden chairs. A fully stocked kitchen lined the far wall. 3 men were already inside. They had been here before the convoy arrived, positioned as an advance guard. They were young, early 20s with the look of men trying very hard to project an authority they had not yet fully earned. Prospects Cordell would later learn. Not yet full members of the club, but sworn to its service and willing to die for the privilege of wearing the patch they had not yet received. One of the prospects stepped forward and spoke briefly with Forge in a voice too low for Cordell to hear. Forge nodded, then crossed the room to the fireplace where a medical kit had been laid out on the stone hearth. He peeled off his flannel shirt, revealing a torso that looked like a topographic map of violence. Old scars, some surgical and some decidedly not crisscrossed his shoulders and ribs. A fresh graze along his left forearm was bleeding sluggishly, a souvenir from the Clubhouse firefight. He cleaned it with antiseptic and wrapped it with the dispassionate efficiency of a man who had treated his own wounds more times than he could count. Delaney watched her father from across the room. She had taken a position near the fireplace, standing with her arms crossed over her chest, her face unreadable. When Forge winced at the sting of the antiseptic, her jaw tightened. When he rolled his sleeve down and flexed his hand to test the bandage, she exhaled slowly. She did not rush to him. She did not cry. She stood and she watched, and she waited until he was finished. Then she walked over and sat down on the hearth beside him. Forge put his arm around her. He pulled her close, and for a moment the entire room ceased to exist. The armed men, the security cameras, the weapons, the war, all of it faded into the background, and what remained was a father holding his daughter in front of a fire. Forge buried his face in her blonde hair. His massive shoulders trembled, once a single involuntary convulsion that he suppressed before it could become anything more. He whispered seeing that Cordell could not hear. Delaney nodded against his chest. Her hands gripped the fabric of his undershirt, and she held on with the ferocity of someone who understood that every embrace from this point forward was borrowed time. When they separated, Delaney wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. One quick motion, efficient, done. She looked across the room and found Cordell standing near the dining table, his hands hanging at his sides. His expression carrying the dazed and displaced look of a man who had been removed from his life with the surgical precision of a kidnapping. She walked over to him. She stopped at arm's length and looked at him directly. She told him she was sorry. Not the rehearsed and hollow apology of someone who had been instructed to say the words. A real apology delivered with the weight of someone who understood exactly what her existence had cost him. She said she never meant for any of this to happen. She said she thought she was protecting her family by running, and instead she had destroyed the life of a stranger who had done nothing except refuse to let her die. Cordell told her it was not her fault. He was surprised by how steady his own voice sounded, how easily the words came despite the chaos churning inside his chest. He could not bring himself to be angry at a kid who had watched a man get murdered and had been hunted ever since. Whatever fury he possessed, and there was plenty of it simmering beneath the surface, it was not directed at her. It was directed at the universe that had decided his particular act of decency should be the one that carried a death sentence. Rowan interrupted the moment with the subtlety of a man who had no patience for sentiment when operational planning was required. He dropped a heavy canvas duffel bag onto the dining table. The metallic clinking from inside the bag left nothing to the imagination. He unzipped it and laid out the contents with the organized precision of a quartermaster conducting an inventory. Firearms, extra magazines loaded with hollow point ammunition, heavy Kevlar vests with ceramic plate inserts, communications equipment, a stack of prepaid burner phones still sealed in their packaging. Rowan addressed the room. He said that Victor Stahl, the head of the Sons of Silence operation in the Twin Cities, was not going to stop. The attack on the clubhouse was not a raid. It was a statement of intent. Victor knew that Delaney was the only witness to his murder of the supplier in the alley. As long as she was alive and capable of testifying, Victor faced a death sentence, not a prison sentence, not a plea deal. A lethal injection. That kind of exposure made a man desperate, and desperate men did not negotiate or retreat. They escalated until the threat was eliminated or until they were dead. Rowan said they could not fight a prolonged war. The Sons of Silence had been consolidating resources for 18 months, recruiting from charters across the Midwest. In a straight fight, numbers would eventually overwhelm them. The only viable strategy was decapitation. Remove Victor Stahl from the equation, and the organization would collapse into infighting and territorial disputes. The body would die when the head was severed. The problem was finding the head. Victor was pathologically paranoid. He moved between safe houses every 48 hours, never used the same vehicle twice, and communicated exclusively through intermediaries and encrypted burner phones. He had not been seen in public in over 2 months. He operated from the shadows, insulated by layers of security and protocol that made him functionally invisible. Rowan's initial proposal was straightforward. Use Cordell as bait. Place him in an isolated location. Let the Sons of Silence scouts pick up his trail. Wait for Victor to send a team and ambush the team when they arrived. Simple, brutal, effective. Cordell felt his stomach lurch. He opened his mouth to object, to refuse to remind everyone in the room that he was an architect who designed commercial office buildings and not a soldier or a decoy or an acceptable casualty in someone else's war. But Delaney spoke first. She stood up from the hearth and walked to the dining table. She placed both hands flat on the surface and leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Rowan with an intensity that made the club president pause mid-sentence. She told Rowan his plan would not work. She laid out her reasoning with a clarity that silenced the room. Victor Stahl was not a man driven by impulse. He was a strategist. If word reached him that a lone civilian architect had been located at some isolated safe house, Victor would not personally ride out to handle the situation. He would send expendable soldiers. Maybe 4, maybe 6. Men he could afford to lose. The ambush would succeed in eliminating a handful of foot soldiers, and Victor would remain untouched in whatever hole he was hiding in, free to reorganize and send another wave. And another, until the attrition wore the club down to nothing. Rowan listened without interrupting. His expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed by a fraction, the telltale sign of a man who was hearing something he had not considered and did not enjoy being told. Delaney continued. She said there was only one scenario in which Victor Stahl would personally expose himself. Only one set of circumstances that would override his paranoia and compel him to leave the safety of his rotating safe houses. Victor had to believe that the threat to his survival was immediate, specific, and too important to delegate. Cordell alone was not that threat. Cordell was a civilian, a loose end, disposable. Victor could have him killed from a distance without losing a minute of sleep. But Cordell plus Delaney together in a location where they appeared isolated and unprotected, with Delaney supposedly carrying physical evidence of the murder evidence that could put Victor on death row without the need for testimony, that was a different calculation entirely. That was the kind of existential threat that a man like Victor could not entrust to subordinates. A target he would need to verify with his own eyes, eliminate with his own hands, because the stakes were too high to risk a subordinate's incompetence. Rowan was quiet for a long time. He looked at Forge. Forge looked at his daughter. The expression on the giant's face was complicated. Pride and fear and fury and reluctant admiration, all of it compressed into the deep lines around his dark eyes. Rowan asked Delaney how they would deliver this information to Victor without tipping him off that it was a trap. Delaney told him they already had the answer. She had given it to them an hour ago at the clubhouse. Detective Colton Merrick, 3rd Precinct. The man whose name she had heard come out of Victor's mouth seconds after the murder. Merrick was Victor's inside man in the police department. If information was fed to Merrick through a channel that appeared authentic, Merrick would relay it to Victor within minutes. Not because he was loyal, because he was terrified. A corrupt detective whose handler had just committed a murder was a man operating under the constant fear of exposure. He would pass along any intelligence that might help Victor eliminate the witness, because eliminating the witness was the only thing that kept Merrick himself out of a federal prison. The mechanism was simple. Cordell would call the 3rd Precinct's direct unrecorded line. He would ask for Merrick by name. He would play the part of a terrified civilian who had escaped from a Hells Angels safe house, claiming that the bikers had discovered his identity and were trying to kill both him and Delaney to eliminate loose ends. He would beg Merrick for a discreet police extraction. He would provide his location. And he would mention with the frantic desperation of a man who did not understand what he was holding that Delaney had physical evidence, something she had taken from the scene, something that could identify the killer. Merrick would call Victor before the phone was back in its cradle, and Victor, hearing that the one witness and the one piece of evidence that could end his life were sitting together in a single location, guarded by nothing more than a panicking architect and a teenager, would come. The room was silent when Delaney finished. The 3 prospects standing by the kitchen exchanged glances. Forge sat on the hearth with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Rowan stood at the head of the table, his fingers pressed together in front of his lips, processing. Rowan said one word, "Where?" That was when Cordell understood that his role in this operation was not as bait. It was as something far more specific and far more valuable. He stepped forward and spoke for the first time in nearly an hour. He told them about the Washburn A mill. The words came out in the measured and precise cadence of a man accessing professional knowledge that he had accumulated over years of training and fieldwork. His firm had been contracted the previous October to conduct a comprehensive structural integrity survey of the abandoned mill complex in the old industrial district along the Mississippi River. The project was a feasibility study for a proposed high-rise condominium redevelopment that had ultimately been killed by the city council due to environmental concerns. Cordell had spent 3 weeks inside that building. He had walked every floor, inspected every column, documented every crack and every failure point with the obsessive thoroughness that his profession demanded. He knew the structure better than anyone alive. The Washburn Mill Annex was a condemned death trap. The primary load-bearing columns along the east wing had been catastrophically compromised by decades of water infiltration and foundational settling. The massive steel grain hoppers, each weighing approximately 20 tons, hung from the ceiling structure on cable and pin systems that had corroded far beyond their rated tolerances. The central hopper, in particular, was suspended by retention pins that his survey report had flagged as a critical failure hazard. A sufficient localized impact would cause a catastrophic detachment. But the building also offered something else: elevated positions with clear sight lines, multiple concealed entry and exit points, a cavernous interior with natural choke points created by the industrial machinery, and most importantly, a location that would appear entirely logical for a panicking civilian architect to choose as a hiding place. The Sons of Silence had been digging into Cordell's background since they obtained his identification. They would know about the survey. They would know about his connection to the building. They would believe without question that a desperate man would retreat to the one abandoned structure in the city whose layout he had memorized. Delaney looked at Cordell. For the first time since he had met her, something close to a smile crossed her face. It was brief and it was thin, but it was there. The location was right, she confirmed. It was the piece that made the entire plan credible. Rowan agreed. The plan had 3 layers of deception. The phone call would convince Merrick. Merrick would convince Victor. And the location would convince Victor that his targets were exactly as vulnerable as they appeared. By the time Victor realized the vulnerability was an illusion, the building would be his coffin. They spent the next 2 hours mapping out the tactical details around the dining table. Rowan produced a set of city maps and blueprints that he stored in a fireproof safe bolted to the cabin floor. Cordell sketched the interior layout of the mill from memory marking positions and sight lines and structural weak points with a mechanical pencil on the back of a topographic map. His hand did not shake while he drew. The architectural precision that had defined his professional life found a new and terrible application in the familiarity of the work. The angles and the load calculations and the spatial reasoning provided a strange and welcome island of competence in an ocean of chaos. Forge would position himself near the mezzanine staircase covering the primary approach to Cordell's elevated position. Rowan and 5 of his most experienced enforcers would occupy concealed positions on the ground floor behind concrete pillars and mounds of derelict machinery. The kill zone would be the central loading bay, the widest open space in the building where the massive grain hoppers hung overhead like steel guillotines waiting to fall. Delaney listened to every detail. She asked questions. She identified a gap in the positioning that would leave the north exit unmonitored, and Rowan adjusted the deployment without comment. She suggested that the call to Merrick should happen no earlier than 3 in the morning, when the detective would be at his most disoriented and least likely to scrutinize the details. She recommended that Cordell's performance on the phone should include specific references to Delaney being injured, unable to move, to ensure that Victor believed time was on his side and that there was no urgency to arrive with overwhelming force. Every suggestion she made was adopted. It was past 1 in the morning when the planning session broke up. Rowan retired to a back room to communicate with other club officers through encrypted channels. Forge stretched out on one of the leather couches, his massive frame barely fitting between the armrests, his injured arm propped on a pillow. He was asleep within minutes, the deep and immediate unconsciousness of a man who had learned to take rest when it was available because it might not be available again. Cordell could not sleep. He sat at the dining table staring at the sketches he had drawn, the lines and angles and structural notations that now represented not a building assessment, but a blueprint for killing. The firelight cast long and shifting shadows across the paper, and the logs in the hearth cracked and settled with sounds that made him flinch. Delaney appeared beside him. She had not gone to sleep either. She placed a mug of coffee on the table next to his hand and sat down across from him. The coffee was black and bitter and exactly what he needed. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the fire, the wind against the shuttered windows, and the distant hiss of Forge's breathing from the couch. Delaney spoke first. She said she knew this was not his fight. She said she understood that 4 days ago he was a man with a job and a house and a life that had nothing to do with any of this. She said she also knew that nothing she could say would make it better because the truth was that his life had been destroyed by an act of kindness, and that was a cruelty that no apology could undo. Cordell looked at her across the table. In the firelight, the feral and desperate teenager from the bus shelter was almost unrecognizable. What he saw instead was a young woman who had spent 2 weeks carrying the weight of a murder, a corrupt detective, and a target on her back, and who had responded not by collapsing, but by developing a tactical plan that a room full of hardened criminals had adopted without modification. He asked her how she was holding together, how someone her age was sitting in a cabin in the middle of the wilderness surrounded by weapons and wanted men discussing the tactical destruction of a drug lord and not falling apart. Delaney was quiet for a moment. Then she told him something that Cordell would carry with him for the rest of his life. She said she had been falling apart every single day since the alley. Every night she saw the flash from the muzzle and the supplier dropping to the ground and the dark spread of blood on the frozen concrete. Every morning she woke up and for 3 seconds everything was normal, and then the memory crashed back over her like a wave, and she had to decide all over again whether to keep going or to give up. She said the difference between falling apart and holding together was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite it. And right now, acting was the only thing keeping her from drowning. Cordell nodded. He understood something about her in that moment that changed the way he saw everything that had happened and everything that was about to happen. Delaney Dalton was not a victim being protected by the men around her. She was the center of gravity around which the entire operation rotated. She had identified the threat. She had exposed the corruption. She had designed the strategy, and she was doing it at 17 years old, sitting in a cabin in the frozen wilderness, with the full weight of a criminal empire trying to kill her. The silence between them was comfortable. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had said exactly enough. Cordell was about to suggest that Delaney try to get some rest when a small and almost imperceptible detail snagged his attention. One of the three prospects, the youngest of the three, had stepped out onto the front porch. Cordell could see him through the narrow gap between the heavy shutters, standing in the moonlight, his back to the cabin. He appeared to be smoking a cigarette, the orange ember glowing faintly against the darkness. Cordell thought nothing of it and turned back to his coffee. But across the table, Delaney had gone completely still. Her eyes were fixed on the same gap in the shutters, and her expression had shifted from the weary calm of their conversation to something sharp and alert. The change was instantaneous, like a switch being thrown. She did not move. She watched the prospect on the porch through the narrow sliver of visibility for a full 2 minutes without blinking. Cordell watched her watching him, and a cold unease began to thread through his chest. The prospect flicked the cigarette into the snow and stepped back inside. He walked past the dining table without making eye contact, crossed the room, and took up his position by the kitchen doorway. Everything about the exchange appeared entirely normal. Delaney leaned across the table and spoke in a voice so low that Cordell had to lean in to hear her. She told him that this was the third time the prospect had gone out onto the porch in the past 2 hours. The man was not smoking. She had watched his hands. There was no cigarette between his fingers during the first 2 trips. He was holding something else, something small, something he palmed and then pocketed each time he came back inside. Her instructions were simple. Stay at the table. Do not react. Then she stood up, walked casually to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and passed behind the prospect close enough to brush his shoulder. The prospect stiffened. Delaney apologized quietly and returned to the table. She sat down and told Cordell that she had felt a hard rectangular object in the prospect's right jacket pocket, approximately the size of a satellite phone or a secondary communication device. A device that had no reason to exist in a location where all personal electronics had been confiscated upon arrival and where the nearest cell tower was over 30 miles away. The man was not stepping out for air. He was transmitting. Cordell felt the blood leave his face. He asked her what they should do. Delaney told him to wake her father. What happened next took less than 4 minutes, but the violence of it compressed into a density that made each second feel like an hour. Cordell crossed the room and placed his hand on Forge's shoulder. The giant was awake before Cordell's fingers made full contact, his hand closing around the grip of the handgun he had placed beneath the pillow with the reflexive speed of a man who slept with one eye on the door. Cordell whispered what Delaney had told him. Forge's expression did not change. His eyes shifted to the prospect by the kitchen doorway, and something dark and final settled into the lines of his face. Forge rose from the couch with a movement that was eerily silent for a man of his size. He crossed the room in 4 long strides. The prospect saw him coming, and his face went white. He took a half step backward, his right hand moving instinctively toward his jacket pocket. He never reached it. Forge's left hand closed around the prospect's wrist and twisted it behind his back with a single fluid motion that drove the younger man to his knees. Forge's right hand reached into the pocket and extracted a compact satellite phone. Military grade. The kind of device that could transmit a GPS signal to a receiving station from the middle of a wilderness dead zone. The other 2 prospects had their weapons drawn, instantly confused and on edge, not understanding what was happening, but responding to the sudden violence with trained aggression. Forge barked a single command without looking at them, and they lowered their weapons. Rowan appeared from the back room, drawn by the noise. He took one look at the satellite phone in Forge's hand and understood immediately. He walked to the dining table, picked up the device, and cycled through the transmission log. His face, already drawn with fatigue, hardened into something that resembled carved stone. 3 outbound transmissions in the past 90 minutes. Short burst data packets. Encrypted, but the destination prefix was consistent with a commercial satellite relay service, frequently used by law enforcement and organized crime networks operating in rural areas. Someone had been receiving real-time updates on their location for the past 2 hours. Rowan looked at the prospect on the floor. He asked one question. He asked who the man was reporting to. The prospect did not answer. Forge applied pressure to the twisted arm. The prospect screamed. The answer, when it came, was delivered through gritted teeth and tears. The prospect had been approached 6 weeks ago by a man he did not know. The man offered money, significant money, in exchange for periodic updates on the club's movements, safe house locations, and senior officer whereabouts. The prospect claimed he did not know who the man worked for. He claimed he thought it was a federal agent running a routine surveillance operation. He claimed he never intended for anyone to get hurt. Forge looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Delaney. Delaney was standing by the fireplace, her arms crossed, her face expressionless. She was the one who had caught it. A 17-year-old girl sitting at a dining table drinking coffee had noticed what 3 armed guards, a club president, and a sergeant-at-arms had missed. Rowan told Forge to handle the situation and to make sure the prospect could not communicate with anyone for a very long time. The specifics of what that meant were left unspoken, but the look in Forge's eyes provided all the clarification that was necessary. 2 of the remaining prospects escorted the compromised man out the back door and into the frozen darkness of the tree line. The sounds that followed were muffled by the wind and the heavy timber walls of the cabin. Delaney did not watch. She turned to Rowan and told him they needed to accelerate the timeline. If the prospect had transmitted their location, they had to assume that the information was already in transit to Victor's network. The original plan called for the phone call to Merrick at 3 in the morning, approximately 2 hours from now. Delaney said they needed to make the call immediately, right now, before whatever intelligence the prospect had transmitted could be cross-referenced with the information they were about to feed through Merrick. The logic was precise. If the prospect's transmissions told Victor that the club was at a cabin in the northern wilderness, and then Merrick received a panicked call saying Cordell and Delaney were hiding in an abandoned mill in Minneapolis, the contradiction would raise immediate suspicion. But if the call to Merrick happened before the prospect's intelligence was fully processed and analyzed, the 2 streams of information would create confusion rather than clarity. Victor would be forced to choose which intelligence to trust, and the phone call coming directly from the man he was hunting would carry more weight than the fragmented data bursts of a compromised informant. Rowan agreed without hesitation. He walked to the kitchen counter, tore the plastic wrapping off one of the burner phones, and slid it across the dining table to Cordell. Cordell stared at the phone. It was a cheap black device, the kind sold at gas stations for $20. In his hand, it felt like a detonator. Delaney pulled a chair beside him and sat down. She coached him through every detail of the performance, her voice calm and instructional, as if she were running a rehearsal rather than preparing him to deceive a corrupt police detective into luring a murderer to a specific location. He needed to stammer, she said, hyperventilate, let his voice crack and break in the places where a genuinely terrified man's voice would crack and break. He should use Merrick's name immediately to establish a false sense of trust, as if Cordell believed Merrick was a legitimate officer who could help him. The story was simple. He had escaped from a Hells Angels safe house with Delaney. The bikers had discovered his identity and were trying to kill them both. Delaney was injured. She could not walk. They needed an extraction before the bikers found them. And then at the very end, almost as an afterthought, delivered with the clumsy urgency of a civilian who did not understand what he was holding, came the final piece, the evidence. Delaney had something from the scene, something physical, a recording, something that could identify the killer. Cordell should say this as if he barely understood its significance, as if he were simply reporting a fact rather than dangling a lure. Cordell nodded. His hands were trembling, but a strange calm had settled over him. The same calm he felt when he was deep into a complex structural analysis, when the numbers and the angles and the load calculations came together into a pattern that made sense. This was a structure too, a different kind of structure, a trap built not from concrete and steel, but from words and deception, and his job was to make it hold long enough for the weight to come crashing down. He dialed the precinct's direct line. It rang 4 times. A night dispatcher answered with a bored and mechanical voice. Cordell asked for Detective Merrick. He said the name with a breathless urgency that was not entirely performed. There was a long pause, a transfer, static. Then a gruff and sleep-deprived voice came on the line. Cordell did not have to fake the terror. The terror was real. It lived in his chest, in his throat, in his shaking hands. He simply opened the door and let it pour out through the phone. He stammered. He gasped. He told Merrick that his name was Cordell Brennan, that he was a civilian, that he had been kidnapped by the Hells Angels and held at a safe house for 2 days, that he had escaped with a girl named Delaney Dalton, that the bikers were hunting them, that Delaney was hurt, that they were hiding in the Washburn A Mill Annex on the riverfront, that they needed help, that they needed a discreet extraction, that they could not call 911 because the bikers were monitoring the main dispatch channels. And then, just as Delaney had instructed, he added the final piece. He said that Delaney had something, a recording she had made on a backup phone the night she witnessed something terrible in an alley, something that could identify the man who pulled the trigger. He said he did not know what it contained exactly, but Delaney said it was enough to put someone away forever, and she wanted to hand it directly to a detective she could trust. The line was silent for 3 seconds. Cordell could hear Merrick breathing. Then the detective's voice came back smoother now, the boredom replaced by a sharp and predatory alertness. Merrick told Cordell to stay where he was. He told him not to call anyone else. He told him he was sending a discreet, tactical unit immediately. He told him not to move. The line went dead. Cordell set the burner phone down on the table. His hand left a damp imprint on the black plastic. He looked at Delaney. She was staring at the phone with an expression that was impossible to read. Then she looked up at him and gave a single slow nod. The hook was set. Victor Stahl was about to receive a phone call from a desperate and corrupt detective telling him that his only witness and the only physical evidence of his crime were sitting together in an abandoned building guarded by nothing but a frightened architect. The irresistible target that Delaney had designed was now live. Rowan moved immediately. He issued commands with the rapid precision of a military officer initiating a combat deployment. The 3 remaining loyal prospects were given explicit orders. Guard the cabin, guard Delaney, shoot anyone who came up the driveway that they did not recognize. Cordell registered the instruction and felt a brief surge of relief. Delaney would stay behind. She would be safe, protected by armed men in a fortified location that was invisible on every map. Forge emerged from the back of the cabin, his demeanor transformed. The wounded father was gone. In his place stood the sergeant-at-arms, a man whose professional expertise was organized violence. He was loading heavy brass cartridges into a staggered magazine with the rhythmic precision of a metronome, each round clicking into place with a sound that echoed in the quiet cabin like a clock counting down. Rowan looked at Cordell. He said they were leaving in 5 minutes. He said Cordell should put on his coat. Cordell pulled the Carhartt parka off the back of the chair and shrugged it on. The familiar weight of it settled over his shoulders, and he was struck by the absurdity of the moment. This coat, this $200 piece of insulated fabric that he had bought on sale at a workwear store in Bloomington. 4 days ago, he had taken it off to save a stranger's life. Now he was putting it on to walk into a building where people were going to die. The convoy assembled in the clearing. 2 blacked-out SUVs, engines idling in the frigid air, their exhaust rising in thick white columns against the moonlit sky. Forge climbed into the driver's seat of the lead vehicle. Rowan took the passenger seat. Cordell was directed to the back seat, where he sat beside 2 of the charter's most experienced enforcers' men, whose names he was not given and whose faces he could barely see in the darkness. The second SUV carried 3 more armed men. The engines revved. The tires bit into the snow, and the vehicles lurched forward, climbing the steep access road and turning south onto the highway. The cabin disappeared behind the tree line, swallowed by the dense wall of pine and darkness. Cordell pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window and watched the frozen landscape blur past. The moon hung low and enormous above the tree line, casting the snow-covered fields in a light that was beautiful and indifferent. The highway was deserted, not a single vehicle in either direction for miles. The world had been emptied, evacuated, as if the universe itself had cleared the stage for what was about to happen. The drive south took 2.5 hours. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the hum of the engine, the rush of the heater, and the occasional metallic click of someone checking a weapon in the darkness of the back seat. Cordell's mind cycled through every phase of the plan, searching for the flaw, the gap, the structural weakness that would cause the entire design to collapse. He could not find one. That did not comfort him. In his experience, the flaws you could not find were the ones that killed you. As the highway signs for Minneapolis began to appear in the headlights, Cordell thought about the night at the bus shelter. He thought about the girl with the blue lips and the frozen mascara and the canvas sneakers soaked through with slush. He thought about the decision he had made in a fraction of a second, a decision that required no analysis and no calculation and no professional expertise, a decision that was nothing more and nothing less than a refusal to let a human being die within arm's reach. He had given away his coat, and now he was driving through the frozen darkness to a condemned building where men with guns were going to try to kill him, and his only allies were the members of a criminal organization he had never asked to join, and the only reason any of it was happening was because he had been decent. The skyline of Minneapolis appeared on the horizon, a cluster of illuminated towers rising from the flat expanse of the frozen prairie. The city looked small and fragile from this distance, its lights trembling against the black skylight candles in a draft. Forge took the exit for the industrial district. The SUVs descended from the highway and entered a neighborhood of abandoned warehouses and empty lots, the skeletal remains of a manufacturing economy that had died decades ago. The headlights swept across chain-link fences topped with rusted barbed wire boarded-up loading docks and the hulking silhouettes of buildings that had not heard a human voice in years. They were close now. Cordell could feel it in the way the men around him shifted in their seats, the way hands tightened on weapons, the way breathing became shallow and controlled. The temperature inside the vehicle seemed to drop, though the heater was still running at full power. The convoy rolled to a stop in a narrow alley behind a row of derelict grain elevators. Forge killed the engine. The silence that followed was enormous. Cordell looked out the window at the towering shadow of the Washburnham mill, rising against the night sky like a monument to industrial decay. He knew every floor of that building, every corridor, every load-bearing column, and every structural failure point. He had documented them all with photographs and measurements and detailed notations in a report that was sitting in a filing cabinet at his office downtown, a relic from a career that now felt like it belonged to a different century. The building was waiting for him, waiting for all of them. Forge turned in the driver's seat and looked at Cordell through the darkness. His expression was invisible, but his voice carried the low and absolute gravity of a man who understood that the next few hours would determine whether any of them lived to see another morning. Forge told him to put on the vest, strap it tight, and when the shooting started, keep his head on the floor and do not move until he was told to move. Cordell nodded. He reached for the heavy Kevlar vest that was waiting for him on the seat, and he began to strap the ceramic plates over his chest, the unfamiliar weight pulling hard against his shoulders, pressing down on him, with the finality of a coffin lid being lowered into place. The Washburnham mill rose from the frozen industrial wasteland like the skeletal remains of a cathedral. Its concrete silos towered against the starless sky, their surfaces pitted and scarred by decades of neglect, their empty window frames staring out across the frozen Mississippi River, with the hollow indifference of a structure that had outlived its purpose and was now simply waiting to fall. The wind howled through the corridors and shattered openings, producing a shrieking, mournful sound that echoed across the abandoned loading docks and empty rail yards surrounding the complex. It sounded like something dying. Something that had been dying for a very long time. Cordell Brennan stood at the base of the rusted iron staircase that led up to the second-floor mezzanine and felt the building speak to him. Not in words, but in the language he had spent a decade learning to read. The faint groan of stressed concrete, the metallic creak of expansion joints contracting in the extreme cold, the subtle vibration beneath his boots that told him the foundation was settling unevenly, the east wing dropping at a rate that had accelerated significantly since his survey the previous October. He knew this building. He knew its bones. He knew where it was strong and where it was rotting, where it could bear weight, and where a single misplaced impact would trigger a failure cascade that no amount of engineering could prevent. 3 months ago, that knowledge had been data points in a professional assessment. Tonight, it was the difference between living and dying. The Kevlar vest beneath his Carhartt parka pressed against his chest with an unfamiliar and oppressive weight. The ceramic plates dug into his collarbone each time he raised his arms, and the compression around his torso made every breath feel like he was inhaling through a straw. Forge had strapped it on him in the alley behind the grain elevators, pulling the Velcro fasteners so tight that Cordell had gasped. Forge had not apologized for the discomfort. He had simply told Cordell that loose body armor was dead man's armor, and then he had handed him a heavy steel flashlight and told him not to turn it on unless the world was ending. The deployment took less than 15 minutes. Rowan Kessler directed his men into position with the quiet efficiency of a conductor arranging an orchestra for a performance that would only be played once. 5 of the charter's most experienced enforcers disappeared into the darkness of the ground floor, each man melting into the shadows behind concrete pillars and mounds of derelict industrial machinery with the practiced ease of predators settling into ambush positions. They carried heavy-caliber handguns, a pair of hunting rifles, and the matte black shotgun that Rowan had been firing in the clubhouse 4 hours earlier. Rowan himself took a position behind a massive cast-iron turbine housing near the center of the loading bay. From there, he had clear sight lines to the main entrance, the secondary loading dock doors, and the elevated mezzanine where Cordell would be waiting. He checked his weapon, chambered around, and then became perfectly still. A shadow among shadows invisible to anyone who was not specifically looking for him. Forge escorted Cordell up the iron staircase to the mezzanine level. The catwalk was a narrow platform of rusted grating that ran along the length of the building's interior, approximately 20 feet above the ground floor. It groaned under their combined weight, and Cordell could feel the bolts shifting in their corroded housings with each step. The structural integrity of the catwalk itself was marginal. His survey report had recommended immediate demolition of the entire mezzanine structure. They reached a position near the center of the catwalk directly above the main loading bay. From this vantage point, Cordell could see the entire ground floor laid out beneath him. The massive concrete pillars, the rusted conveyor systems, the mountains of decayed industrial debris, and suspended from the ceiling structure hanging from cable and pin assemblies that his report had flagged in bold red text as a critical failure hazard, the 3 enormous steel grain hoppers. Each hopper was a roughly cylindrical vessel approximately 12 feet in diameter and 15 feet tall, constructed of riveted steel plates that had once held thousands of pounds of grain. They hung from the ceiling like inverted bells, their lowest points roughly 10 feet above the ground floor. The central hopper, the largest of the 3, was positioned directly over the widest section of the loading bay. Its primary retention pins, 2 heavy steel bolts that anchored the main suspension cable to a crossbeam in the ceiling structure, were corroded to approximately 15% of their original load-bearing capacity. Cordell had noted in his survey that the hopper was effectively hanging by a thread, held in place by the residual tension in the cable system, and a prayer. Adjacent to the catwalk railing, bolted to a support strut, was a heavy industrial winch. The winch controlled a secondary cable that ran up to the ceiling and connected to the same crossbeam that supported the central hopper. The locking mechanism on the winch, a spring-loaded pin assembly designed to prevent the cable from spooling under load, was seized with rust. and tucked into the corner beside the winch left behind by scrappers who had picked through the building years ago was a heavy steel crowbar. Cordell looked at the crowbar, he looked at the winch, he looked at the hopper hanging from the ceiling above the loading bay. The structural engineer in his mind ran the calculations automatically, the way a musician's fingers find the right keys without conscious thought. Impact force required to shatter the corroded retention pins. Estimated mass of the hopper. Terminal velocity at a fall distance of 20 feet. The resulting kinetic energy upon impact with the ground floor. The secondary effects on the already compromised load-bearing columns in the east wing. The numbers were catastrophic. If that hopper came down, it would not just hit the floor. It would go through the floor, and the shock wave from the impact would propagate through the compromised column structure like dominoes falling in sequence. Forge positioned himself at the top of the iron staircase, crouched behind a section of collapsed ductwork that provided both cover and a clear firing angle down the steps. He rested his shotgun across his knee and checked the loads one final time. Then he looked at Cordell. He told Cordell to stay low. Stay behind the generator housing. Do not stand up. Do not look over the railing. Do not try to be brave. When the shooting started and Forge said this with the absolute certainty of a man describing Sunrise Cordell's only job was to stay alive long enough for the club to finish the fight. Cordell nodded. He crouched behind the rusted housing of a defunct industrial generator, pressing his back against the cold metal. The Carhartt parka was already accumulating a thin layer of frost from the ambient moisture in the freezing air. His breath plumed in thick white clouds, and he tucked his hands beneath his arms to preserve what little warmth remained in his fingers. Then the waiting began. Every minute stretched into something vast and shapeless. The silence inside the condemned building is absolute, broken only by the wind tearing through the corridors and the occasional metallic groan of the structure settling under its own compromised weight. Cordell stared at the darkness below and thought about things that had no business occupying the mind of a man sitting in a kill zone. He thought about the load-bearing wall he had been designing for a client in Edina before all of this started. He thought about the battery in his Honda Civic that he had never gotten around to replacing. He thought about his mother in Duluth, who expected a phone call every Sunday evening and who would by now be wondering why her son had not called. He thought about the bus shelter on Lake Street, the girl with the blue lips, the decision that had taken less than 2 seconds and had cost him everything. He did not regret it. That was the strangest part. Sitting in a condemned building, wearing body armor, waiting for armed men to arrive and try to kill him, Cordell Brennan did not regret giving his coat to a dying girl. He would do it again. He knew that with a certainty that felt like bedrock, immovable and fundamental, the one thing in his life that he was absolutely sure about. The thought did not make him less afraid. It simply made the fear bearable. At exactly 4:45 in the morning, the silence broke. It began as a distant sound barely distinguishable from the wind, the low crunch of heavy tires rolling over frozen gravel approaching from the south along the access road that ran parallel to the river. Cordell heard it first as a vibration in the steel railing beneath his hand, the catwalk picking up the ground-borne tremor before the sound reached his ears. Then he saw the headlights. Piercing halogen beams cut through the darkness, sweeping across the frosted interior of the mill in blinding shafts of white light. The beams moved slowly, methodically scanning the building the vehicles approached. 3 black utility vans, unmarked and identical, rolled into the cavernous loading bay in a tight formation. They moved with the synchronized precision of a military convoy, each vehicle maintaining exact spacing from the one ahead. The van stopped. The engines idled for several seconds, filling the space with a low mechanical hum that resonated off the concrete walls. Then the engines cut out simultaneously, and the loading bay was plunged back into a silence that was somehow more oppressive than before. The side door slid open. Cordell watched from his elevated position behind the generator, housing his face pressed against the cold metal, one eye angled over the edge just enough to see the ground floor below. What he saw made his stomach drop into a place he did not know existed. The men stepping out of the vans were not bikers. They were not wearing leather cuts or denim vests or patches that identified their allegiance to any motorcycle club. They were dressed in slate gray tactical gear, the kind worn by special operations units and private military contractors. Ceramic plate carriers over ballistic vests, tactical helmets with integrated communication systems, night vision optics mounted on swivel arms above their left eyes. and in their hands held with the casual proficiency of men who use them as daily tools, suppressed short-barreled submachine guns with foregrips and laser designators. 12 of them, a full tactical squad deploying from the vehicles in a diamond formation with the fluid discipline of soldiers who had rehearsed this exact maneuver hundreds of times. Cordell felt the air leave his lungs. This was not a biker gang raid. This was not a group of leather-clad enforcers rolling up with pistols and bad intentions. Victor Stahl had reached into a network that extended far beyond the motorcycle world and had brought a professional paramilitary hit squad. Men who killed for a living, men who did not miss. Walking in the center of the diamond formation, shielded by 360 degrees of heavily armed operators, was Victor Stahl himself. He was not what Cordell had expected. He was lean, almost gaunt. His head was shaved close, revealing the angular structure of a skull that looked like it had been carved from pale stone. He wore a long, dark trench coat that fell to his ankles, and he moved with a calm that bordered on theatrical, each step measured and deliberate, as if he were walking through a garden rather than entering a condemned building in the middle of a freezing January night. He carried a single weapon, a massive polished silver revolver that rested in his right hand the way a cigarette rests between the fingers of a habitual smoker. Casually, comfortably, an extension of the body rather than an accessory. Victor stopped in the center of the loading bay. His eyes scanned the dark balconies and the shadowed recesses of the ground floor with the patient thoroughness of a man who was accustomed to hunting. He showed no urgency, no anxiety, no evidence that he suspected anything other than what he had been told. A frightened architect and an injured teenage girl hiding in the dark, waiting for a rescue that would never come. He spoke. His voice echoed off the decaying concrete walls with an unnervingly smooth and measured quality, devoid of the gravel and aggression that characterized the men Cordell had been surrounded by for the past 4 days. It was the voice of a man who did not need to raise his volume because he had never encountered a situation where he was not in complete control. Victor told his men to spread out and secure the perimeter. He told them the architect was hiding somewhere high. He told them to find him and put a bullet in his head. He told them to locate the girl, and then he told them to burn the entire building to the ground. Rowan did not wait for the tactical squad to establish their perimeter. From the darkness along the eastern wall, a single shot rang out. The deafening crack of a high-caliber hunting rifle shattered the silence with a concussive force that made Cordell's eardrums compress. One of the armored mercenaries at the edge of the formation dropped instantly, his body snapping backward and slamming into the frozen concrete with a sound like a sack of grain hitting a loading dock. The response was immediate. The tactical squad did not scatter or panic. They dropped into combat stances with the synchronized precision of a machine weapon-shouldered night vision. Optics engaged. Suppressed submachine gun fire erupted from multiple positions simultaneously, the rapid stuttering bark of the weapons punctuated by the distinctive snap of bullets breaking the sound barrier. Tracer rounds cut through the darkness in phosphorescent green lines, ricocheting off the rusted machinery and concrete pillars in showers of orange sparks. The Hells Angels returned fire from their concealed positions. The deeper boom of heavy-caliber handguns and the thunderous blast of the shotgun answered the tactical squad's weapons, and for several seconds the interior of the mill was transformed into a strobing, deafening hellscape of muzzle fire, ricocheting rounds and shattering concrete. But the disparity in firepower was immediately apparent. Victor's men were firing armor-piercing rounds that punched through the concrete pillars as if they were drywall. The thick columns that Rowan's men were using as cover began to disintegrate under sustained automatic fire chunks of concrete, exploding outward and showering the ground floor with debris and dust. One of the enforcers behind a pillar was struck in the seat, the round penetrating his leather jacket and spinning him to the ground. Cordell was flattened against the mezzanine catwalk, his hands clamped over his ears, his face pressed into the rusted grating. The noise was beyond anything he had experienced at the clubhouse. The clubhouse firefight had been chaotic and close quarters. This was organized and systematic. The mercenaries were laying down overlapping fields of fire that carved the ground floor into kill zones, methodically neutralizing the bikers' positional advantage. Rowan's voice cut through the chaos from behind the turbine housing. He was calling out positions, redirecting fire, trying to adapt to an enemy that was moving with a discipline his men had never faced before. 2 of his enforcers had shifted positions, flanking left toward the loading dock to catch the tactical squad in a crossfire. But the mercenaries anticipated the move and 2 of them peeled off to counter their night vision, giving them an overwhelming advantage in the near-total darkness. Victor Stahl had not moved. He stood in the center of the loading bay, his trench coat dusted with concrete particles, his silver revolver hanging at his side. He watched the firefight with the detached interest of a man observing an experiment. Then he raised his free hand and pointed directly up at the mezzanine. He told his men the architect was up there. Suppress the bikers. Take the catwalk. 4 of the mercenaries broke off from the main engagement and moved toward the iron staircase with terrifying speed. They advanced in a 2x2 stack formation, their weapons sweeping the shadows ahead of them, their boots making almost no sound on the frozen concrete. Forge saw them. The sergeant at arms rose from his position behind the collapsed ductwork at the top of the staircase. He fired his shotgun from a standing position, the massive blast illuminating the upper level in a flash of yellow fire. The lead mercenary took the full spread in his chest plate. The ceramic armor absorbed the impact, but the kinetic force lifted the man off his feet and hurled him backward into the operator behind him. Both went down in a tangle of limbs and weapons. But the remaining 2 mercenaries reacted with lethal precision. They separated, one diving left and one right, creating dual firing lanes that Forge could not cover simultaneously. Suppressed rounds punched through the ductwork, sparking off the metal and tearing through the thin aluminum like paper. Forge fired again, catching one of them in the shoulder below the plate carrier. The man spun but did not go down. He braced against a support beam and returned fire on full automatic. The burst caught Forge across the left shoulder and the upper thigh. The impacts were devastating. Heavy tactical rounds designed to penetrate body armor at close range tore through the sergeant at arms with a force that would have killed a smaller man instantly. Forge staggered. His massive frame absorbed the kinetic shock in a way that defied physiology, but his legs buckled. He collapsed heavily against a concrete support beam, his shotgun sliding across the grated floor and disappearing over the edge of the catwalk. Blood was already soaking through his flannel shirt in 2 rapidly expanding patches of dark crimson. His breathing became ragged and shallow, the sound of a man whose body was beginning to fail him, despite the fury of a will that refused to surrender. The 3 mercenaries who were still standing advanced up the staircase. They moved in a tight formation, their weapons raised their laser designators, painting red dots across the walls and the ceiling, and the prone figure of Forge slumped against the support beam. They were going to finish him. They were 3 seconds from putting rounds into a man who was already bleeding out on the floor. Cordell watched from behind the generator housing. He was 12 feet away, close enough to see the red laser dots dancing across Forge's chest. Close enough to see the blood pooling beneath the giant's legs. Close enough to hear the wet, rasping breath that meant a lung was compromised. Something broke inside Cordell. Not his courage, not his resolve. Something structural. Something deep and load-bearing that had been holding up the architecture of his identity as a passive and ordinary man. It collapsed, and what rose in its place was not bravery in any traditional sense. It was the absolute and unthinking certainty that the man bleeding on the floor had thrown his body between Cordell and death twice in 4 days, and that allowing him to die without acting was a structural failure that Cordell's soul could not survive. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not have one. What he reached for was the crowbar. His eyes went to the ceiling. The central grain hopper hung directly above the 3 advancing mercenaries, its massive steel body suspended by the corroded retention pins that his survey report had condemned in explicit and detailed technical language. The industrial winch beside him on the catwalk was connected to the secondary cable system that ran to the same crossbeam. The locking mechanism was a spring-loaded pin assembly, corroded, seized, but not welded. A sufficient impact on the mechanism would release the spring tension, allowing the cable to unspool under the weight of the hopper. And once the secondary cable released, the corroded primary pins would be bearing the full 20-ton load alone. They would not hold. Cordell lunged for their crowbar. His fingers closed around the cold steel, and he pulled it from the corner with a strength that came from somewhere beyond his muscles, beyond his training, beyond anything he had ever accessed in his quiet and unremarkable life. He sprinted 3 steps to the winch, raised the crowbar above his head, and brought it down on the locking mechanism with every ounce of force his body could generate. The impact rang through the catwalk like a bell being struck with a sledgehammer. Sparks erupted from the contact point. The rusted spring housing cracked, but did not break. Cordell raised the crowbar again. He heard Rowan screaming at him from somewhere below, the words lost in the cacophony of gunfire. He heard the mercenaries shout, their attention drawn by the metallic crash above their heads. He did not care. He brought the crowbar down a second time, aiming for the fracture line in the housing, driving the steel bar into the weakened metal with the precision of a man who understood exactly where a structure needed to be struck to make it fail. The locking pin shattered. The sound that followed was unlike anything Cordell had ever heard. The heavy steel cable, freed from the winch mechanism, whipped through the pulley system with a shrieking metallic scream that cut through the gunfire like a razor through fabric. The secondary support cable went slack. The full 20-ton weight of the central grain hopper transferred instantaneously to the corroded primary retention pins. For one agonizing fraction of a second, the pins held. The metal groaned. The crossbeam above flexed, visibly bowing under the sudden load. Rust flakes rained down from the ceiling in a shower of orange particles. Then the first pin snapped. The sound was sharp and clean like a rifle shot. The hopper lurched 3 inches to the left, swinging on the remaining pin with a pendulum motion that sent a deep structural shudder through the entire building. The second pin held for another half-second, long enough for Victor Stahl, standing in the center of the loading bay directly below, to look up. Long enough for the expression on his lean and angular face to transition from controlled authority to the raw and absolute terror of a man who understood what was about to happen and knew that there was nothing in his power, his wealth, or his network of violence that could prevent it. He screamed a single word: move. The second pin gave way with a sound like a thunderclap. 20 tons of riveted steel dropped from the ceiling in a free fall of 30 feet. The hopper plummeted through the dusty air with a speed that the human eye could barely track, a massive cylindrical shadow blotting out the halogen headlights from the tactical vans below. It struck the ground floor with the force of a localized earthquake. The impact was cataclysmic. The concrete floor cratered beneath the hopper, the reinforced slab cracking and buckling outward in a radial pattern that extended 20 feet in every direction. The 3 mercenaries on the staircase were caught in the blast radius of displaced air and shrapnel. Chunks of concrete and twisted rebar were launched outward at ballistic velocity, and the men were swept off the staircase and thrown against the far wall with a force that ended them before their bodies hit the ground. The shockwave rolled through the building like a detonation. The already compromised load-bearing columns along the east wing, weakened by decades of water damage and foundational settling, absorbed the kinetic energy of the impact and transmitted it directly into the structural framework of the building. The first column buckled. A vertical crack appeared in the concrete, running from floor to ceiling in a jagged line that widened as Cordell watched, and then the column gave way entirely. It collapsed inward, pulling a section of the ceiling with it. The cascading failure had begun. Massive chunks of the ceiling structure began to cave in each falling section, redistributing its load onto adjacent columns that were already operating beyond their rated capacity. The effect was exponential. 1 column fell, then 2, then 4. Then the entire east wing began to groan and buckle with a sound that was less a noise and more a physical sensation, a deep and tectonic vibration that Cordell felt in his chest, in his spine, in his teeth. Concrete rained down on the ground floor. Tons of it, heavy slabs of reinforced material that had supported the upper floors for over a century now, fell in cascading sheets, burying the tactical vans, the scattered bodies of the mercenaries, and the derelict machinery beneath an avalanche of gray rubble and twisted steel. Victor Stahl was thrown off his feet by the initial shockwave. His silver revolver skittered across the floor and disappeared into a crevice in the broken concrete. He tried to crawl toward the loading dock exit, his trench coat torn and his shaved head bleeding from a deep laceration above his left ear. He moved with the desperate clawing urgency of an animal whose instincts had overridden every higher function. He made it 15 feet before a massive steel girder dislodged from the collapsing ceiling structure fell across his lower back. The girder pinned him cleanly to the floor, its weight pressing him flat against the broken concrete. He screamed. The sound was high and thin and utterly stripped of the smooth composure that had defined his voice minutes earlier. The firing stopped. The silence that replaced it was enormous, an absolute, broken only by the settling groans of the dying building and the distant crash of secondary collapses deep within the structure. A thick, impenetrable cloud of concrete dust filled the air, reducing visibility to less than 5 feet. The halogen headlights from the surviving van cut through the haze and diffused beams that illuminated nothing but swirling gray particles. Cordell clung to the catwalk railing with both hands. The mezzanine had survived the collapse, its western mounting points still anchored to a section of wall that had not been part of the failure cascade. But the structure was swaying, the bolts were groaning. He had minutes, maybe less, before the catwalk joined the rest of the east wing on the ground floor. Below him, through the haze of dust and smoke, he saw movement. Rowan Kessler emerged from behind the turbine housing, limping heavily. The club president's face was covered in soot and blood from a cut above his eyebrow, and his left arm hung at an angle that suggested a dislocated shoulder. But he was upright, and his weapon was still in his functional hand. Two of Rowan's enforcers were still moving, pulling themselves out from behind cover positions that had partially collapsed around them. A third was down motionless beneath a pile of concrete debris. The remaining two were unaccounted for, buried somewhere in the rubble. Rowan walked to the support beam where Forge was slumped. The sergeant-at-arms was still conscious. His eyes were open and he was pressing his right hand against the wound in his shoulder with a pressure that was weakening visibly. Blood covered the front of his flannel shirt and pooled on the rusted grating beneath him. But when he saw Rowan's face through the dust, he grinned. A wide and red-stained grin that showed his teeth and transformed his pain-ravaged face into something that looked almost like triumph. Forge looked up at the mezzanine at Cordell, standing at the railing with the crowbar still gripped in his white-knuckled hand. He said 4 words, his voice barely audible over the groaning of the building. He said the suit brought the house down. Rowan looked up at Cordell. The expression on the club president's face was something Cordell had not seen directed at him before. Not gratitude, not relief. Respect. Genuine, unqualified respect from a man who did not distribute it casually. Rowan told Cordell to get down. They were leaving. Protocol was over. The war was won. Cordell started toward the staircase, moving carefully along the swaying catwalk, testing each section of grating before committing his weight. He was halfway to the stairs when he heard it. A voice, coming from the direction of the loading dock, cutting through the settling dust in the groaning steel, with a clarity and a calm that stopped Cordell mid-stride. The voice belonged to Delaney Dalton. She walked through the shattered loading dock entrance with a steadiness that defied everything about the situation. She was not supposed to be here. She was supposed to be 150 miles north, locked in a fortified cabin, guarded by armed men with explicit orders to shoot anyone who came up the driveway. She was supposed to be safe. But Delaney had not stayed behind. She had followed the convoy south. How she had done it, whether she had convinced one of the prospects to drive her, whether she had taken a vehicle on her own, whether she had found some other way, that only a girl who had grown up in the orbit of an outlaw motorcycle club would know, Cordell did not yet understand. What he understood, standing on the swaying mezzanine looking down at the girl who had started all of this, was why. She had come because she was the target. She had always been the target. Not Cordell, not the club, her. The girl who had witnessed the murder. The girl whose testimony could end Victor Stahl. And she had decided somewhere during those long hours in the cabin, while the men who were supposed to protect her drove south to risk their lives on her behalf, that she was not going to sit in a room and wait for other people to determine whether she lived or died. She walked across the rubble-strewn ground floor, stepping over broken concrete and twisted rebar, her boots crunching on the debris with a steady rhythm. She moved toward the spot where Victor Stahl lay pinned beneath the steel girder. Forge saw her. From his position against the support beam, bleeding and broken, the giant tried to rise. He made it to one knee before the wound in his thigh failed him, and he collapsed back against the beam. He called her name. His voice cracked on the first syllable, the desperate sound of a father watching his daughter walk toward the man who had tried to kill her. Delaney did not stop. She did not look at her father. She did not look at Rowan or at the armed men scattered across the ruined ground floor. She looked only at Victor Stahl. She stopped 3 feet from where he lay, pinned to the concrete. The steel girder across his lower back had immobilized him completely. His hands clawed weakly at the broken floor, leaving shallow gouges in the dust. His face was turned to the side, pressed against the cold concrete, and when he saw the boots standing in front of him, his eyes tracked upward. He saw a 17-year-old girl standing over him in the ruins of his ambition, standing over the wreckage of his tactical squad, his paramilitary mercenaries, his network of corruption and violence, standing over it all with an expression that carried no rage, no vengeance, no triumph, only a calm and absolute certainty that was more devastating than any of those emotions could have been. Delaney spoke. Her voice was steady. She told Victor that she had been carrying something since the night she watched him kill a man in an alley behind the Grainbelt Brewery. Not just the memory, not just the fear. She'd been carrying a recording. Victor's eyes widened. The muscles in his jaw contracted, and what remained of the blood in his face drained away, leaving behind a pallor that matched the concrete dust coating his skin. Delaney told him that when she was hiding behind the dumpster, her phone was recording. She had opened the voice memo application moments before she entered the alley, a habit she had developed for recording class lectures at school. When the gunshot went off, the phone was already running. It captured everything. The gunshot, the fall, the phone call Victor made to Detective Colton Merrick. His name, his rank, the instructions to clean up the scene. When she dropped the phone in the alley, she lost the original device. They found it. They wiped it clean. But before she ran in the chaos and the terror, she had done one thing right. She had synced the recording to her cloud account, an automatic backup that uploaded the file to a remote server before the phone ever hit the ground. They destroyed the phone, but the recording was already sitting on a server they would never find. Victor's clawing hands went still. Delaney told him what she had done with the recording. She told him she had composed 3 separate emails, each containing the audio file, each addressed to a different field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Minneapolis, Chicago, Washington. Each email was saved in her drafts folder with a delayed send function. If she did not log into her account and cancel the scheduled transmission within 12 hours, the emails would send automatically. The countdown had started 4 hours ago when she left the cabin. Even if he killed her right now on this floor, the recording would arrive in the inboxes of 3 federal agencies before the sun came up. Merrick would be arrested, the audio would be analyzed, and Victor Stahl, pinned beneath a steel girder in the ruins of a condemned mill, would spend whatever remained of his life in a federal supermax facility waiting for a lethal injection. She told him it was over. Victor stared at her. The silence between them stretched across the rubble-strewn floor like a wire pulled to its breaking point. His lips moved. No sound came out. Then his forehead lowered to the concrete and his hands went flat against the floor, palms down, fingers spread. The posture of a man who had been carrying the weight of his own empire and had finally been crushed by it. Delaney turned away from him. She walked back across the rubble toward her father. Forge was watching her with an expression that Cordell could not fully read from the mezzanine, but that seemed to contain every emotion a human face was capable of producing simultaneously. Pride, terror, love, fury, grief, awe. She knelt beside him. She took his massive hand in both of hers. She told him she was sorry for not staying at the cabin. And then with the ghost of a smile crossing her exhausted face, she said she was not sorry for coming. In the distance beyond the shattered walls of the mill, the wail of police sirens began to echo across the frozen Mississippi River. Multiple units, coming fast. The real police this time responding to the structural collapse and the reports of gunfire that had filtered through the dead zones of the industrial district. Rowan gave the order to move. The enforcers who could still walk helped those who could not. Cordell scrambled down the remaining section of the mezzanine staircase, his boots slipping on rubble and dust, the crowbar still in his hand. He dropped it on the concrete floor and crossed to where Delaney was helping Forge to his feet. Cordell got under the giant's other arm, and together the 3 of them dragged Forge's enormous weight across the destroyed loading bay toward the concealed exit behind the dock. The SUVs were waiting in the alley engines, running exhaust rising in white columns against the pre-dawn sky. They loaded Forge into the back seat, his blood staining the leather upholstery, his breathing labored but stable. Rowan climbed into the lead vehicle. Cordell and Delaney took the back seat of the second SUV. They pulled out of the alley and accelerated onto the access road, just as the first MPD cruisers breached the perimeter of the industrial district, their light bars painting the crumbling facades of the warehouses in frantic pulses of red and blue. Behind them, the Washburn. A mill continued to settle and collapse section by section, burying Victor Stahl and the remains of his mercenary squad beneath hundreds of tons of concrete and twisted steel. The building that Cordell Brennan had surveyed and condemned was completing the process he had documented, returning itself to the earth, with the slow and inexorable patience of all structures whose time has come. The Minneapolis Police Department officially ruled the mill collapse a catastrophic structural failure triggered by thermal stress fractures in the foundation during the extreme cold event. A subsequent investigation discovered the bodies of several unidentified individuals in the rubble, along with weapons and tactical equipment consistent with organized criminal activity. The case was referred to the FBI, who connected the deceased to a network of paramilitary contractors with ties to interstate drug trafficking. Victor Stahl was pulled from the rubble alive. He was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center under armed guard, where he was treated for spinal injuries that would confine him to a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. He was subsequently indicted on federal charges, including first-degree murder, racketeering, conspiracy, and the murder of a confidential federal informant. The evidence against him included an audio recording that had been submitted anonymously to 3 FBI field officers on the morning of the mill collapse. Detective Colden Merrick was arrested at his home in Bloomington 6 hours after the collapse. The charges included corruption, obstruction of justice, accessory to murder, and conspiracy. He did not resist arrest. He did not make a statement. He sat in the back of the federal transport vehicle and stared at the floor with the empty expression of a man who had always known this day would come. Cordell Brennan never returned to his drafting table at the commercial architecture firm on Hennepin Avenue. He submitted his resignation by letter citing personal reasons and collected his final paycheck through direct deposit without setting foot in the building. The life he had lived before the night at the bus shelter, the quiet and predictable existence of a junior architect who argued about zoning permits and load-bearing walls, belonged to a man who no longer existed. That man had died somewhere between the clubhouse and the cabin, and the condemned mill replaced by someone who understood that the distance between an ordinary life and an extraordinary one was measured not in miles or years, but in a single decision made in a fraction of a second. He opened his own architectural practice the following spring, a small firm operating out of a converted storefront in northeast Minneapolis, specializing in residential design for veterans' transitional housing. The work was unglamorous and modestly paid, and it required a patience and a compassion that the commercial world had never asked of him. He loved it in a way he had never loved the glass towers and corporate lobbies of his previous career. When the following winter rolled in as fierce and unforgiving as the one before it, Cordell found himself standing on the porch of the cabin by the lake on a Saturday afternoon. The pine trees were heavy with snow, and the frozen expanse of Mille Lacs stretched out to the horizon in a field of unbroken white. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray column, and through the frosted windows the warm glow of the fireplace painted the interior in shades of amber and gold. Delaney was in the yard building a snowman. She was wearing a heavy winter coat, proper boots, and insulated gloves. Her cheeks were flushed with cold and effort, and she was packing snow with the focused determination of someone who approached every task, no matter how trivial, as if the outcome mattered. She had enrolled in an early admission program at the University of Minnesota the previous fall, declaring a pre-law concentration. The counselors had raised eyebrows at the intensity of her application essay, which discussed in carefully anonymized terms the experience of navigating a justice system that had been corrupted from within. She was 17 years old, and she already knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. Forge stood beside Cordell on the porch. He leaned on a heavy wooden cane, his left leg still recovering from the surgery that had repaired the damage from the bullet wound at the mill. His right arm was in a sling. His beard had grown longer, and there were more gray threads in it than there had been a year ago. But his eyes, dark and steady and alive, watched his daughter in the snow with an expression that contained no pain, no regret, and no fear. Only the quiet and ferocious gratitude of a man who had come within 30 minutes of losing his world and had been given it back by a stranger with a $200 coat. Without speaking, Forge reached behind him and picked up the familiar navy blue Carhartt parka that had been draped over the porch railing. He lifted it with one hand and settled it across Cordell's shoulders, pulling it snug against the wind that was beginning to pick up from the north. Cordell pulled the coat tighter around his chest. The same coat, the same weight, the same warmth. The coat that had saved a girl's life on a frozen bus stop, that had carried his identity into the hands of killers, that had traveled through a world of violence and loyalty and come back to him stained with concrete dust and someone else's blood. He watched Delaney pat the final handful of snow onto the snowman's head and stepped back to admire her work. She looked up at the porch and saw the two men standing there, the giant leaning on his cane and the architect wrapped in the coat that had started everything. She raised one gloved hand in a wave that was simple and unadorned, carrying no weight beyond the moment itself. Cordell raised his hand and waved back. The wind carried the scent of pine and frozen lake water across the clearing, and the snow continued to fall in soft and steady curtains, from a sky that stretched unbroken to the edge of the world.